What kind of mind conceives a weapon out of starvation itself? Genghis Khan, known as the Great Khan of the Mongols, perfected the siege starvation tactic into a terrifying instrument of conquest. His armies didn't simply overrun cities, they surrounded them, sealed them off, and waited. Not for days, but for weeks, sometimes months. Inside, bread turned to dust, rats vanished, and the dead were quietly consumed. In 1219, when Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, he besieged the great city of Nishapur. With no means to break through the city walls quickly, the Mongols surrounded the settlement entirely. They blocked all food supplies, poisoned nearby wells, and established a complete perimeter, ensuring no one could enter or escape. The method was deliberate, not desperate. Mongol engineers were trained to calculate how long provisions would last within the city. Once the starvation threshold passed, desperation drove defenders into collapse. Some cities surrendered before a blade was drawn. Others resisted, only to fall into horrors far worse. According to Persian chronicler Juvaini, known as Atamalik Juvaini, the inhabitants of besieged cities were sometimes forced to eat leather, grass, and in the most extreme cases, even the corpses of the dead. None remained to bury the corpses, he wrote of Merv, another city that faced starvation under siege, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful. When the gates finally fell, the Mongols were not merciful. The survivors, gaunt, skeletal, barely human, were massacred or enslaved. The siege starvation tactic was not just a means of victory, it was a psychological weapon to show that resistance would lead not only to death, but to a slow, humiliating and helpless end. Taken as spoils, the fate of captured women. Genghis Khan, known as the universal ruler of the Mongols, led one of the most ruthless expansions in history. His armies didn't just defeat their enemies, they dismantled entire societies. And in the wake of each victory, the fate of captured women followed a chillingly predictable pattern. After the sack of Bukhara in 1220, the Mongols seized thousands of women and girls. Many were distributed among the soldiers as rewards for their service. The higher the rank, the more prestigious the captives. Noble women were often set aside for Mongol generals or even for Genghis Khan himself. Lower-ranking women were divided among the troops or forced into menial labor, servitude, or worse. Juvaini, the Persian chronicler who followed in the footsteps of the Mongol conquests, recorded how, after cities were taken, they separated the men from the women, the children from their mothers, and drove them into camps like herds of sheep. The language was not metaphorical. It reflected the cold, industrial scale of human handling the Mongols had perfected. Women were often paraded before commanders, ranked by appearance, age, and social class. Beauty became a curse. Historical accounts from Chinese, Persian, and Russian sources alike describe how Mongol leaders took pride in seizing the wives and daughters of defeated nobles, not only as concubines, but as a symbol of absolute dominance. The humiliation was intentional. To possess the women of a vanquished foe was to erase his legacy. Some women were incorporated into Mongol households and forced into marriage. Others were sold into slavery across the vast stretches of the empire, from Central Asia to the Yuan court in China. Only a few, if any, retained their identities. For Genghis Khan's empire, expansion was not only about land, it was about people, reduced to property, consumed by war. And among the most defenseless were the women, whose suffering remains one of the darkest legacies of the Mongol path to empire. Among the many brutal tactics employed by Genghis Khan, known as the founder of the Mongol Empire in 1206, the use of human shields stands as one of the most coldly calculated. This was no accident of war. It was a deliberate, systematic policy. Captured civilians, often from recently conquered towns, were forced to march ahead of Mongol troops into enemy lines. Their bodies served a grim purpose, absorbing the first barrage of defending arrows, exhausting the enemy's firepower, and sowing confusion. One of the most infamous examples took place during the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, particularly at the siege of Gurganj in 1221. As resistance stiffened and defences grew desperate, Genghis Khan ordered thousands of prisoners, mostly women, children and elderly men, to be pushed forward as a buffer between his forces and the city walls. Persian historian Juvaini, who chronicled the Mongol campaigns in his work Tarikh-i-Jahangushay, noted how the Mongols spared few lives when a city resisted, but paradoxically preserved captives only to use them as disposable tools. "They used the people of one city to batter down the next," he wrote, grimly documenting the machinery of terror in motion. These human shields were placed in front of siege engines or tied together in lines to prevent escape. Some were made to dig trenches, haul supplies, or fill moats, all while under enemy fire. If they survived the assault, they were often killed afterward, having outlived their usefulness. This tactic served more than a military function. It sent a chilling message: surrender or see your neighbours and kin forced to die in your place. The sheer ruthlessness shattered the morale of many defenders before a single blade was drawn. To the Mongols, war was not governed by chivalry or mercy. It was governed by results. And if victory meant sacrificing thousands of innocent lives to weaken a fortress's resolve, then that price was not just acceptable, it was expected. For Genghis Khan, war was total. Not just soldier against soldier, but entire populations used as pawns in a horrifying game of conquest. Death by Tramplings, verdict of the Steppe. In 1223, after the Mongols crushed a coalition of Russ's princes and their Kipchak allies at the Battle of the Kalka River, the survivors faced not mercy, but a calculated and humiliating end. The Mongols, led by generals Subutai and Jebi under the command of Genghis Khan, had no intention of treating their captives as honourable foes. Instead, they turned their punishment into a spectacle of absolute dominance. Mstislav of Kiev and other captured Russ's nobles were not executed by blade or by fire. According to both Russi's and Persian sources, the Mongols laid these princes face down in the earth. Then, in a calculated performance, they constructed a large wooden platform directly on top of the living bodies. A great feast was held above, where the Mongol commanders drank and dined, while their prisoners slowly suffocated beneath them. Historical accounts vary in some detail, but the Russian primary chronicle and later Persian narratives agree on the essential horror. The Mongols chose this method specifically because it caused immense suffering without spilling a drop of blood. In Mongol legal and cultural tradition, especially when dealing with highborn enemies, it was sometimes taboo to shed noble blood directly. So they devised a method of killing that was brutal, yet technically bloodless. The result was excruciating. As the feast wore on, the weight of the platform and the men seated atop it crushed the life out of those below. When the banquet ended, so had the lives of the Russ's nobles. Their bodies were broken, their dignity erased. This execution was not simply vengeance, it was a demonstration, an act of psychological warfare as much as physical punishment. By turning death into a grotesque feast, the Mongols declared their supremacy not just through force, but through domination of memory, reputation, and legacy. Dragged behind horses, the punishment reserved for traitors. Among the punishments carried out under Genghis Khan's rule, one stood out for its specific use against betrayal, being tied to the rear of a horse and dragged until death. This was not a common battlefield execution. It was a targeted sentence, used primarily against those who had violated trust, defectors, spies, or governors who surrendered a city and later resisted. In Mongol law, treason was not simply disobedience, it was a disruption of the Khan's world order, and it demanded a public, irreversible response. The punishment was direct. The condemned individuals' hands were bound, sometimes their limbs dislocated to prevent resistance. Then they were fastened with ropes to a mounted horse. At the command of an officer, the animal was spurred forward. The victim was pulled across uneven ground, often over long distances. Death did not always come immediately. It could take minutes or longer, depending on the terrain. Historical examples of this sentence appear during the Mongol campaigns in Central Asia and the Middle East. When cities under Mongol control rebelled or governors were found to have secretly conspired with rival powers, this method was one of the standard forms of execution. It was public, efficient, and left a visible warning behind. A mutilated body dragged through the dust, discarded in front of the city walls. The reasoning behind this form of execution was rooted in Mongol concepts of loyalty and deterrence. Genghis Khan had established a strict code of laws known as the Yasa, which emphasized absolute allegiance to the state and to the Khan himself. Anyone who endangered internal unity was treated as a deliberate threat to the empire's stability. There was no need for prolonged spectacle. This punishment was fast and final. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer, it dismantled worlds and rewrote the rules of power through fear, discipline, and unforgiving justice. Its punishments were not chaos.